Welcome to this week's edition of the Open Book with Amy and Tommy. We're focusing on Jesus's transfiguration in Scripture. This is a story that we see in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so we're going to be looking at that today as we end up the season of Epiphany. So Amy, would you like to lead us off and read the Scripture for us today?
I will, and we'll be reading the story from Luke chapter 9. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent. And in those days, no one told any of the things they had seen. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks
be
to God.
Tommy, where do you want to start?
I'm going to start at the beginning just because.
Okay.
Why not? I've always been intrigued by this text. Is why it's Jesus and only 3 of the disciples instead of all 12 of them. So I've been reading a little bit about that, and I'm not sure I still have any idea the answers, but the way I've been thinking about it best is I do this now when I go to lunch or if I'm going to the store or something. I usually say, "Hey, does anybody want to join me?" And so I can imagine Jesus saying, "Hey, I'm going up to the mountain. Does anybody want to come with me?" And the disciples say, "To pray?" And he says, "Yeah." And so they say, "No, we'll just stay here." And 3 of them say, "Yeah, we'll go with you. We'll accompany you." And so it almost feels like it's not that big a deal, it seems like, at the beginning. Maybe these are Jesus's 3 favorites. I don't know. But it almost feels like these are some of the ones that have been following him. Maybe these are the ones who are loyal. Maybe these are the ones that really want to go. Some have thought of them as the most spiritual. I'm not sure that that's right, but at least they're willing to go with Jesus to pray. And I think that's fascinating too, that how often Jesus goes up on the mountain to pray.
Yeah.
And maybe this happens all the time. And so at some point the disciples say, "No, this time you just go. I'm good."
Yeah.
Well,
and sometimes he goes by himself and he sends them all away. And so maybe they asked, "Hey, can we go with you? You're always doing, what is happening?"
Yeah, I wonder.
Yeah. And I want to talk about both of these things too, because they both jumped out at me. One other possibility, and I've been thinking about this lately, and I've had a couple of conversations about this. Sometimes we have different people for different things, and the way our relationships work. Some people have one person who is their person for everything, but a lot of us have different people for different things. If I want to talk about books, I have this group of people. If I want to talk about, children's curriculum, I have this group of people. And so if I want to talk about cooking, I have this friend. And I was talking to my daughter the other day, and I said, "Well, who is your person? If you were really feeling troubled, who would you who would you go to? And she said, well, it depends on what it would be. And so she had people, and so for different needs, different people. And so perhaps, Jesus chose them because he was mentoring them, or they were the friends who did this, while these friends were the ones who, and other of his disciples, we don't know. And so it's interesting to think about relationships. But what really stood out to me is how we do life and we do faith. Both are dependent on relationships.
Yes.
We cannot do them in isolation. And Jesus modeled that by doing life and his personal faith and relationship with God in community. So that was the first thing that stood out to me. And then again, just to take a note on the priority Jesus spent in prayer and on his spiritual life. And so
this story is one that's easy to rush past this first verse and jump
there's
to
so much
the
in it.
transfiguration part and Jesus and Elijah and Moses. But if we start there at the beginning, just like we've said, it's Jesus going up to the mountain to pray with his people. I like kind of like that terminology. And interestingly enough, here it says 8 days. The other two synoptic gospels say 6 days. But I think there's some symbolic. I was reading about some symbolism here that the 8 days is more of a symbol that that you're beginning an entrance into a new age, I guess, or a new journey. So that there's something happening here. And that Luke is using some symbolic numbers more than it was 8 days. I don't know that it matters if it was 8 or 6.
Yeah,
but he's also saying that they had a lot of emphasis on numbers in that time, and 8 becomes a kind of the number of something new. And so I thought that was interesting too, to think about how Luke's theology is very symbolic, and it's really rooted in some symbolism, but and also I think he has a lot of interest in he goes back and forth between the Exodus, I think, Jesus's baptism. There's a lot about identity here. Who is Jesus and what has he come to do?
We begin the season with the baptism, where they hear God's voice saying, "This is my son." And we end this season with the transfiguration, when again we hear a voice in the clouds that say, "This is my son, my chosen." And so a lot about the season is about identity, and we've talked a lot about that, and knowing who we are, and as children of God, and seeing ourselves and others as that. So that's helpful and really interesting to think about how this season is held in context of Jesus's identity as the Son of God.
And right before the text we get today, and I guess this is, I don't know where this falls in the lectionary, but in the Bible, it's right before this text where we have Peter's confession, because Jesus asked, "Who do people say that I am?" And then we start getting these stories of what the disciples have heard people say, who they've heard people say Jesus is. And then he turns it on them and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And you get the wonderful confession of Peter, who says, "You are the Christ." And then it's not much later when Jesus starts telling about what that means, that he'll suffer and die, that Peter says, "No, not you, Lord." And that becomes a temptation. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," because you're not thinking about things in the right way. And so I think it's interesting, so that we get into this identity question from baptism to the previous chapter, "Who do you say that I am?" And it's a question that we have to ask ourselves throughout all of this. And then we move into this transition. This transition to something new. which involves a couple other T words: transformation, transfiguration, all of these things as Jesus moves toward Jerusalem.
So one thing, and I hope I'll be able to say this clearly, that right here in this moment and this moving into, this is such a great text for us right before we begin Lent, because prayer is a significant practice of Lent, and so Jesus is modeling that for us. Also some time set apart and transformation. Tomorrow night, I'm going to be teaching our children about Ash Wednesday and Lent, and we're going to talk about the time that Jesus spent in the desert. And when we talk about that, we're going to talk about, and that being a time, and so then how for us Lent is a time for us to think about who we are and who we're meant to be, and doing some evaluation and possibly making some changes and transformations in who we are and what we do, so that we can be who God created us to be. And so this passage really fits well and invites us to think about what practices and what actions and activities we need to do to transform and to be who God has created us to be. So thinking about Lent as a time where people give up or take on things to be more focused on God and their relationship with God.
Yes, that's good. And part of what we're giving up is I think I've had these conversations recently about social media, and listened to some others about social media, and how one person told me that they had to do social media all the time so that they could keep up with the language of their own generation. So they wanted to make sure they weren't missing out on anything, and that they could conform their lives to what they were seeing on social media. Now, they wouldn't have said it exactly that way,
right?
But that's how I heard it. I have to know what's happening so that I can be fully up to speed, and I can do that too, because I want to understand. When I hear this slang term, I want to know what it means, so that people don't look down on me as not being up in the culture.
Yeah.
And so I think there's so often we're being formed by things that aren't spiritually formative. They're just telling us who we are, rather than letting God tell us that we are beloved children of God, just as God shared that through Jesus. Jesus is a beloved child of God.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, so Lent, as we move into Lent, we have to let go of some of those things that tell us who we are, that are at odds with who God has said that we are.
Right. And good and bad, and what forms us. And so then I'm going to skip down later in the passage when the disciples were like, oh, let's just stay here. Let's just stay in this moment.
Yes.
But that is not the life that God has called us to, is to reach this and then we're done, and that's all we have to do, or we escape from. We are to live as God's created, creation and Christ's body in the world. We are to live in relationship with others, and as we said in the beginning. And so so what that looks like all sorts of things, like, oh, I'm going to church and I'm doing all the things, and that's enough. And sometimes we get a nudge, sometimes we get a real clear response of, yep, nope, that's not it, there's more. And living our faith in the world. So
yes. And it's interesting here. So when I think of mountaintop experiences, that always has a positive feel for me. I don't get that in this text, even though I do find it, I don't know what the word is, kind of interesting and metaphysical. And it's hard for me to imagine what this might have been like for the disciples, especially as they're looking on and seeing Jesus's face change, and then his clothes start to glow. And there's Moses, who maybe represents the law, and Elijah, who maybe represents the prophets.
Yeah.
And how Jesus is there with them. And, but in Luke's gospel, I believe it's only in Luke's gospel, it says they appeared in glory and were speaking about his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. If I may be wrong, but I think I'm right, that Matthew and Mark don't even mention what Jesus, Elijah, and Moses are talking about. But here it says they're talking about his departure. And actually the word is from where we get the word Exodus. They're talking about his Exodus, it can be translated. And it's really, they're having this conversation about Jesus headed toward Jerusalem and what that's going to be, what's going to happen, how it may lead to his death, or will lead to his death, we know. So I think this is an interesting thing, that what's happening on the mountain with Jesus here is not maybe a lot different than what's happening in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is trying to work this out.
Yeah.
He just has a community that's helping him work it out.
Yeah.
And then you have the disciples up there. Go ahead.
And a practice that's helping him work it out. It's, I think prayer. I've also been thinking a lot about prayer lately, and what that, and so often we think about prayer as, but thinking about what prayer looks like, and it can be, well, last Sunday in worship, I love that George, the deacon, prayer invited us to look around, and that's so different and not something that we typically do. And what is it like to walk, and what is it like to have clay in your hand, and what are the practices, and how do we do it? But prayer is a time and a way we can work out and work through. And it doesn't have to be just sitting and talking. It can be, and that can be very productive times, but there's lots of other ways. Prayer is something that is active and a gift. And so Jesus, so seeing you have people and a practice that helps you work through what you are.
Yes. Yeah. There's so many different ways. We can get limited on how we think of prayer.
Yeah.
And then prayer becomes ineffective for us in a lot of ways. And there are a lot of wonderful ways out there to think about it. I'm a Labyrinth fan. So if I've got something to work out, I tend to go to the Labyrinth. Yeah. Because I have to walk it out.
Yeah.
I think about, what my question is, and just walk in circles for a while. Yeah. And then and it orders me, but it also moves me. And I don't know. There's some wonderful ways to get at that. Yeah. But so with these disciples, they're here. What I mentioned Gethsemane a little bit, because I think there's some similar things Luke's doing here with Gethsemane, in that it says in the text that the disciples are, my words, battling sleep. Jesus is out there praying. He's focused on this prayer, and the disciples are having a lot of trouble staying awake. And then there are two ways to translate the text here. It's either because they stayed awake, they got to see this, or it could just as likely, and this is how I translate it, once they were fully awake, they were able to see this. So they're dozing, or they're fighting it, or they're trying. I don't know. I've done this in prayer too. Like, please help me stay awake. I need to finish this thought or conversation. Or I'm in church on a Sunday morning, and I'm like, my eyes just keep falling. Right. I'm like, so I understand the battling with sleep in the midst of some things that should be spiritually formative.
Right.
But I think it does. There's a metaphor here too for us. In Gethsemane, Jesus says, couldn't you stay awake one more hour?
Yeah.
I think sometimes this becomes a metaphor that we don't take some of these things as important, or they're not as vital as they
Right.
should be for us. And we need to
Right.
like wake up to what God is calling us to be and do in
Yes.
these moments that are
Yes.
so hard.
Yeah. What is central and what is more important? So then sharing one of my personal prayer practices, and I'm going to get one off the shelf. I have several hourglass timers. For me, my practice is needing to stop. Yours is walking it out, and I busy myself with doing something to have something, because then I can. And so, but I find that for me, sometimes what I need to do is stop. And so I'll get one of these out and I'll set it on my computer or on my desk, and
Yeah.
I'll just watch and wait. And there's no typing, there's nothing on my phone, there's no reading, there's no doing anything. And which is a reminder for me to stop and pay attention to what is happening right here, which is perhaps what Jesus is calling the disciples to do. Like, you're so busy and you're focused on the wrong things, and so you're missing this moment. And so sometimes, rather, when I feel myself getting lost in all the things, then I stop,
It's good.
and then I re-engage, and it's less frenetic, and it's more focused, and it's more intentional, and it's more clear, and it's not trying to do 15 things at one time, but it's okay, here is what I need to be doing in this moment. So that's one practice that helps me.
It's good. Yeah. I think finding ways that we can step away.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And not have to do more, and to know that we are enough.
Mm-hmm.
I go back and forth with this, but I don't know if balance is the right word, but I go back and forth between this doing and being kind of concept. How do we follow Jesus to say, hey, yeah, let's go to the mountain and pray. And then also following this text, Jesus goes down and heals. So he goes back into ministry of caring for those who need it most.
Right.
And so that action versus love in action versus love through prayer. I'm not sure what the right word is there, but those are hard things to go back and forth on, because I can find myself getting lazy if I stop too much.
Sure. Well, but I think they're connected, and if we can hold them together, what we do can be informed by who we are, and we can discover who we are by stopping and being in God's presence. And so, and being can help us sense a couple of different things. Being helps us reconnect with our priorities, or really helps us get clarity on what really matters in a moment. And so I think if we can hold them both in tension and not lean too far either way, that they can inform each other and have a beautiful partnership. And I think Jesus models that really well, when there are times where Jesus says, it is time to go away and pray. And then in the prayer, it doesn't say, no, we stay here, or let's stay here longer, but let's go on, and then gets back to work. And so, so seeing them in relationship with each other, and that there's not, neither one is right. Neither one is the only one. I think having them live in conversation with each other. And so walking the labyrinth, saying a prayer, watching the hourglass, doing whatever to be for just a moment can help clear out the clutter and help us know what is our work to do, which is the question we'll be, talking with the kids when we talk about Ash Wednesday, is thinking about, that Jesus spent time in the desert thinking about what was his work to do.
And there's that phrase in our text for today, he didn't know what he said. Speaking of Peter,
yeah,
that he, saw this, didn't know what to do with it. And instead of doing nothing, felt like he needed to do something or to say something. It's, it's often the case in scripture that that becomes our biggest problem, is when we don't know what to say, we say something anyway.
right.
You get Job and his friends, they're doing great until they speak.
Yeah.
You've got Peter, he's experiencing all this. He's probably doing a pretty, he's being amazed by all of this wonder and glory, and then he speaks.
Yeah.
And so I wonder sometimes if we're too quick to speak instead of experiencing what's happening.
Yeah.
We try to do something to make it better than it currently is, or something to that effect.
Right. Rather than, that mindfulness and living in the moment and being present in the moment, and the experiences of, it's a fascinating time when I was growing up and I was in the band in high school and middle school, my parents didn't have a camcorder and they didn't have cell phones. So there was no recording. And so they sat and watched and enjoyed the concert, and there were no pictures and there were no videos. But these days, if you go to a middle or high school band concert, you're going to see maybe about 50% of people holding their phones up. And it's so hard. But trying to be present in the moment and not capture that moment, or not trying to expand that moment, but letting that moment be what it is. And I think that's far beyond a concert. I think that's true in all the things. And so I want to tell Peter, just put the camera down and just savor. You have this gift of a moment. And it is fleeting, and enjoy it and live in it. And so that calls me to, what are those moments in my life, in my faith, that I need to stop evaluating and planning and just being and living in.
Yeah, I have a video from Christmas one year. It was a long time ago, but it was when the video cameras were this big and they sat on your shoulders. And I remember 3 people in one of my family gatherings, at least 3 people, maybe 4, had one. And all you saw in the videos were other people videoing. So there was nothing, the experience was just seeing other people videoing each other. And you lose the moment. You want to capture it for all times, and I appreciate that.
Right. And that is with the best of intentions of, this is something, and I don't ever want to forget this, and I don't ever want to not have this, and I want it forever and always. And so, I mean, the intention is beautiful and wonderful, and is a recognition of the sacredness of that moment. So that's not a criticism, because as a mom at the middle school band concert, I struggle with, am I going to watch? Am I going to record? I can't do both. And whichever one I'm doing, I'm aware of the other one. And so it's so hard. But I have been putting the camera down and really just trying to enjoy, because there is nothing better than living in the moment, because watching it over and over isn't as good as it was live and in person. And so there's a real gift in that. So I think there's then the challenge for us, in our faith, in our relationships, savoring, appreciating, being mindful, being present to them, not trying to overplan them and not trying to overextend them, but being present and being awake to those moments.
Yeah. That's good.
What else do you have as we wrap up? Which, I don't know, maybe you have 20 more minutes. So
I do not have 20 more minutes. I do again, I like this text. I think one of the things that just keeps coming back to me about this text is context. Is it's hard to read this text without knowing what happened before and after.
Yeah.
And I think we do that a lot. Because like I said, that this is talks about Jesus' identity, but we've already had that with baptism and here. But there's also a calling that happens right before this too, where Jesus says, if anyone wants to be my followers, that person must take up the cross and follow me. So there's something here too. It's not when this comes back to Peter's kind of protesting that still. Peter's just like us, is that taking up our cross and following Jesus is not really our idea of a good time. We would much rather see Jesus in all his glory and just experience those wonderful, joyful moments. And think, wow, this is awesome that I get to spend time with Jesus.
Yeah.
But it's hard to kind of move in a different direction there, to let go of some of the things that are just those fillers in our lives that we think give us joy, and actually follow Jesus, which might mean taking up our cross, which might mean letting go, as you said, of some of the things that pull us away from God, and taking on some things maybe that leads us closer to God. Those are the hard things in all of this. So again, this mountaintop experience feels there's a conflict for me there. Jesus is talking about his death or his impending death. Peter's wanting to stay there in the moment of glory. But in the end, Jesus says, so this is my son, listen to him. So you have to take up your cross and follow. The identity is belovedness. But that belovedness it's not just about I don't know what the word is, hey, I need to take a picture of this. Hey, isn't this sweet? There's not a nostalgia to belovedness. It's about being kind and not demanding your own way and not repaying evil for evil. It's loving your enemies, as we talked about last week. It's not easy. Love is not easy, but it's good.
Right.
It brings joy. And when we try to fill that God-sized hole with anything less than God, then our lives they're not as fulfilled as they could be.
Absolutely.
So anyway, so I like this text, but I also know that this text moves us and moves Jesus to turn his eyes toward Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And that everything that happens from this point is leading to a cross.
Yeah.
Which in turn leads to resurrection, I understand.
Right.
But too quickly, if we move too quickly, we forget that it does involve a cross.
Yeah.
And you can't have resurrection without a cross.
And so this then brings me back to the word transformation, and how the life of faith is a life of transformation. And with that, always and ever changing. And just as Christ,
yes,
the physical presence was changed, but just thinking about it's and with transformation, growth. So not change for change's sake, but change and transformation for completeness sake. And that's the journey that we are ever on, but particularly moving into Lent, that is a purpose of that season, or at least has been for me, is really thinking about self-reflection and transformation, and being open to what God is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So holy transformation.
That's good. So
Yeah.
it's, faith is, there's an ultimate concern to this. Faith is not something we do half-heartedly, but it's wholehearted faith.
Yeah.
As Rachel Held Evans calls it, it's not something we just put on the side. Our spiritual practices are not something we do when we feel like it. We continue them. We pray daily. We read scripture daily.
Mm-hmm.
We worship with the body of Christ daily. We have to remind ourselves that we're beloved daily.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to forget all of these things.
Yeah.
And get comfortable until we realize our comfort has not produced the fruit that we hope to produce. It's not, hasn't mattered as much. So anyway, I think we just have to jump in with both feet, and that's the hard part.
It is. And stay awake.
Yes. So I don't have anything else, but I did want to talk about Ash Wednesday briefly.
Please do.
Because let's talk, and I wanted everybody to know that's watching this is we have a little bit different. We have 3 opportunities on Ash Wednesday, which is a little different from normal. So from 7:30 to 8:30 in the morning, that's a.m. I will be there, and maybe some other ministers who can get up that early. We'll be out in the front, right in front of the steps at the church, assuming it's not raining, and we're going to have a drive-through ashes. So if you want to get your ashes that morning, you can drive through, and we'll put the ashes on your forehead or your hand, and speak those words. From dust you were made, to dust you shall return. To remind us of our own mortality. And when we remember our own mortality, we remember what it means to live. And then we also, if that doesn't work out for you, we have a noontime in the sanctuary where we'll have piano music playing for that hour, and ministers will be there to give you ashes as well. And then more traditionally, we'll have our regular Ash Wednesday service that evening at 6:00. And Mac will give a homily. There'll be music, there'll be prayers, and we will also allow you to receive ashes from one of the ministers. So those are the things that are happening as we begin the Lenten season on March the 2nd. So I hope that you'll be a part of that. And as Amy said, I hope you'll think of ways to reflect on what God may be calling you to be or do differently during this Lenten season.
Yeah.
Anything else?
And if you want to talk and explore that with someone, please reach out to me or Tommy or one of the other pastors, and we are glad to talk about what that may look like as you are discerning that in your own life. Let me also add, we invite you to come Wednesday evenings during Lent to our Lenten Vesper service, which will be a time and create a time of quiet and reflection and worship, an intentional time that you can set aside. So we invite you to come to that. And Tommy's going to hold up.
I was trying to find my Lenten card.
I knew what you were looking for.
So this is a Lenten card that you can find around the church, and it has some of the events that are coming up during the Lenten season. I hope you'll take one, put it on your refrigerator so that you can see it regularly and find ways you can participate. Also share it with a friend and invite them to be a part of this journey toward Lent, the cross, Easter.
So this week, we hope that you will stay awake. Look for opportunities to be with people who help you in your life and in your faith, and that you prioritize prayer and living in relationship with God. So be blessed, live in peace, and we will gather again next week.
Peace.